pleasure to introduce John Cooper. I can't get this little message that comes around saying I've got to give my consent before I can do anything else. So let's do that. Okay. John, as I think some of you heard at the beginning in conversation, John has a long connection to Faringdon. I first saw John, and in fact, last saw John when he was quite a young lad, as a young family growing up in the manse in Coxwell Road with his parents, David and Veronica Cooper. Now, David was a good friend, and Veronica. David was a minister at the United Church in Faringdon, and since then, I'm not quite sure exactly where he went, but he's certainly been in Edinburgh and also in Shetland Islands. And the only thing I do know about John's life since Faringdon is that he's got a very impressive CV. He's worked for agencies helping Christian Aid and the Joint Public Issues team to engage in advocacy and action to help shape the world into something more just. And you can't get much more impressive than that. His current role is as the director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, who are a community of people who are inspired by the life and teachings of Jesus to oppose war and work together to build a world order based on love. I think I've got that right. John's come this evening to talk to us about the Pacific nuclear testing and Britain's role in it. The title of his talk is Grappling with the Past to Build a Peaceful Future. And I think we'd all agree with certainly the second part of that, and we'd be interested to hear what John has to say about the first part of it. So I think I've said enough. So over to you, John.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Great to almost be back in Faringdon. This is my second time working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. The first time was around 10 years ago, and so I'm inching closer to Faringdon every time. Last time it was just seeing it on the front of a bus. Now it's at least joining the peace group virtually. I worked out it must be nearly 30 years since I lived in Faringdon, and in some ways I can't remember everything about it. I can remember the Folly, partly because of its regular appearances in Dad's Army, the pantomime, or at least Babes in the Wood, the United Church and glimpses of it, some large church lunches, trips out to various villages in the Cotswolds, either for church outings or for walks, possibly a health food shop on the high street, and I'm sure there must be more. Oh, an orange supermarket. Reality is, unless I spend some time studying, visiting, and learning, probably will never be able to fill in all the bits I've already forgotten. It's part of my history, but how much of Faringdon do I really know? And that's the starting point for my talk this evening. It's late January 2020, and I receive a slightly obscure phone call. Would I be interested in joining a World Council of Churches visit to Fiji and what was then known as the Christmas Islands? This call was part of a global journey, or pilgrimage in World Council of Churches language, to points of conflict or previous conflict around the globe. The aim was simple, to create a moment of encounter and learning, which then sparks reflection and action from those who take part. Once my participation had been agreed by work, it was time for me to mug up. By that, I mean find out where on earth the Christmas Islands were, discover they weren't the ones near Australia, instead there were another set of Christmas Islands, much closer in some respects to Fiji, and to work out how to fly there, either via Australia or the United States. What I discovered in my research and then through my almost visit, I'll tell you more about that in a minute, opened my eyes to parts of our own corporate and national history that I was not aware of. Since I returned, we've had lockdown, we've had renewed interest in climate change continue, we've had Black Lives Matter. In many respects, all of these could have served to alienate me from what I experienced. However, for me, the intersections or crossovers are so clear that's in the main what I want to cover tonight. I'm particularly glad to be joined here by Brian because I'll reference both people who lived on the islands and nuclear test survivors from this nation in some of what I say. A brief overview which gives you a hint of the title. After the Second World War, Britain returned to developing its own nuclear weapons, and in the early 1950s, we tested them in the Pacific region. The tests happened because, it's been suggested, the area was viewed by the Ministry of Defence as a relatively uninhabited wilderness. And having flown over, at first you can see why. Huge expanses of ocean and then tiny islands. And yet, if you actually landed on any of the islands, you'd soon find vibrant local cultures and quite a few people living on the islands. Britain ran a series of 4 tests in the region. Each one was known as GRAPPLE and then a letter. And they tested the detonation ability and the size of each explosion. All of the tests happened within 3 years because there was about to be a change in international law to restrict the ability of nations to test nuclear weapons. I think it would be fair to say the testing of the nuclear weapons could be described as crude. Reports from military personnel and people living in the region indicate little or no protection for many of the people who witnessed the tests. Ron Watson, a British military veteran, told Dr. Becky Alexis Martin from Manchester Metropolitan, "I had my back to the explosion, my eyes closed with my hands covering them. I clearly saw the bones on my hand, just like you see them if you look at the results of an X-ray." Let's think about that for a moment and think about the pandemic we've just lived through in which personal protective equipment was seen as so important. Becky's research highlighted many service people were provided with what you would call rudimentary protection, what the government currently call protection relevant to what was known at the time, and ultimately had their lives fundamentally changed by the radiation they were exposed to. A member of the British Servicemen's Test Survivors Association recently shared his experience with the ambassador from Kiribati. As the countdown progressed, we would assemble on the soccer pitch wearing our standard tropical uniform consisting long trousers, long sleeve shirt, our safety equipment of dark goggles and a radiator film badge. We sat on the ground with our backs to the blast. When the countdown reached 0, there was a loud bang. The sky changed from black to bright blue, as though the sun had been turned on. As the fireball dissipated, we were permitted to turn and look at it, keeping our goggles on. Short time later, the effects of the blast came in the form of a strong wind. The sight was breathtaking. The variety of colours changed as the glow dissipated and the mushroom cloud developed. As the test progressed, he said, we became rather blasé and did not bother to get out of bed. We just put on our goggles and turned over with our backs to the explosion and waited for the fireball to dissipate. Once the event was over, we'd dress, have breakfast, and our normal working day would continue. I'm not sure how that relates to Brian's experience, and I hope he feels comfortable to share later, but that's not an uncommon example that was shared. The tests became increasingly powerful as Britain tried to get its combination of science and explosion correct. While it's clear the testing wasn't always successful, the overall result was Britain being seen as the third thermonuclear power and its testing of the biggest independent fission bomb that it ever had. This second bit was a fact kept secret until the end of the Cold War. After Britain ceased its testing in the region, America carried out one more series of tests on the Kiribati Islands. Ever since, British Fijian and native Kiribati residents have, at different moments, asked for support as they viewed their health and their homes being fundamentally changed by the testing. The most recent debate in Parliament happened in 2019 and was secured by the shadow SNP spokesperson for Armed Forces and Veterans. If you look up the report from Parliament, you soon see a strangely polite to and fro going on. She would advocate for the rights of the people sent by the British state to the vicinity of the testing. The Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Defence would reply, citing the fact that under official terms, the people sent there were under civilian obligations, therefore not covered by a significant amount of legislation. But what the debate really failed to engage with was the significant history of health defects monitored among those who were there. It's thought there's about 130,000 people descendant from people who lived there under nuclear testing. They report 10 times the normal level of birth defects, organ malformations, and leukemia. She then shared one person's personal story. What that actually showed was while it was nearly 70 years ago the tests happened, people are still living with the legacy today. Later this year, the world will descend on Glasgow to discuss its progress in meeting targets set at the global climate talks held in Paris 2015. The COP, as it's known, is an important meeting. It provides an opportunity for the world to up its ambition and reduce its carbon footprint. As people of peace, and it's good to hear it in the earlier notices, we should be interested in this. The pursuit, extraction, and securing of fossil fuels are linked to conflict and violence and human rights abuse. Therefore, any move to rid the world of fossil fuels moves us towards a more peaceful future. But in among all the positive work that may go on, and I can send you later a briefing that Quakers and others are putting together for anyone meeting their MP, there is one issue that's not currently being discussed or explored: the carbon footprint, or should that read bootprint, of the military.
Yes.
Why? Because the Paris Climate Agreement is a political agreement, and powerful nations lobbied to ensure the military emissions were not included. Scientists for Global Responsibility suggest the UK military bootprint is at a minimum the size of 6 million UK cars' annual emissions. Then you start looking at things like the American figures. What has this got to do with military testing? Traveling to the wider Pacific region, it's soon clear how reliant the region is on the sea for its food and its income generation. Fishing and seafood are central to life, to culture, to economy, and to community.
Hello?
Berberenga Ayotueba lived on the island during the tests. She explained the local food was contaminated by the bombs. You'd get food poisoning, even drinking from fresh coconut. All fish except shark gave us cramps. Sometimes we were given medicine from the soldiers. The islanders had to continue to eat and become unwell. The service people were ordered not to eat the local foods. The advice, don't eat shellfish that's come from the sea floor, was still being passed to me 60, 70 years on, as I was preparing to visit at the start of last year. But there's another side to this as well. The military infrastructure left littering the island. The rush nature of the tests no doubt impacted on the amount of debris left behind. A 2009 survey of the island reported waste included radium luminized dials, asbestos paintwork, fibrous asbestos, battery stockpiles, bitumen spills, and large numbers of heavily corroded military vehicles and structures. These were left in piles round the island and posed a significant hazard to the local population. The British government at least did find some way of beginning to tidy that up. However, the exportation of the nuclear waste highlighted just one small fact. To ship nuclear waste from near Fiji to the UK, initially going to be Cumbria, required a huge amount of paperwork. At the last minute, the shipping firm declined to take the waste. So in the end, it had to be flown halfway around the world. So we're in a situation where a seabed has been affected and waste was left to rust on an island for many years. But that's not all. People living on that island are now seeking a new home. Rising sea levels mean this very low-lying island could be one of the first to disappear as our global temperatures continue to rise. And already people were moving from Kiritimati to Fiji. And you sit down and you listen to people, and what you soon heard was people grieving. They were losing their culture. They were losing their community. Yes, they were safe on a new island, but it wasn't their home. So as we seek to create peace in our world, it's important we never forget that climate price paid in the development of weapons, as well as the carbon emissions emitted by their use. But disregard for the local sea environment is only one part of the story. The next, which I found equally staggering, was what you could call the geopolitical views wrapped up in Britain's testing. Let's scroll back a moment. It's 1945, and Britain wants to keep its place at the world of global superpowers. The empire supposedly passed its peak in 1901, and it's beginning to shrink or at least look a bit shaky. New nuclear weapons are a way to reinforce the might of knowledge and strength the UK wants to have. Finding somewhere to test these new weapons was proving tricky. Existing agreements with Australia didn't allow for testing in the air, But the use of an empire and the assumptions that come with it soon provide for some geographic flexibility. The islands were part of the empire, and Dr. Martin suggests they were described as uninhabited. And yet, as many writers from the region indicate, derogatory and belittling views of indigenous cultures are traceable to the early years of interactions with the Europeans. It's left people scarred with the idea that, in effect, there was an era of darkness before the colonial people arrived, and then light and civilization afterwards. And this was something I encountered and had to struggle with when meeting people mainly in Fiji, speaking with people and trying to come to terms with what I viewed as a very negative influence that some people said was very positive. But let's think for a moment. We're a small island nation up in the north. What gave us the right to think we can fly these weapons of mass destruction halfway around the world and detonate them? Looking back at the chain of conversations that led to the waste coming back to the UK, it's soon clear all of the disregard that happened. But let's not also think about the impact to the people that they were tested on. Tabu Titea was 11 at the time of the first test. She described how her community was unexpectedly moved at midnight by military commanders. She was frightened, but the local military commander said, "Don't worry, this is the British military." And so there she was, scooped up, put on boats that she said were meant for cargo, with little room for children to play. That's for people removed from the space. Philomena Lawrence was too young to remember the tests, but heard people talk about them. She said there was little understanding of the harmful effects. Instead, islands were put on boats and told to watch a Disney film to distract them during one test, and at another, gathered on a tennis court and covered in tarpaulin. You can imagine how terrified people might feel, particularly when they weren't understanding some of the science and all that was going on. The lasting impact of these tests, beyond the generations whose health and local environment has been impacted, is a wider sense of injustice. It's the end of a strange 2 week visit, mainly in Fiji, because COVID lockdown meant I couldn't make it to the Kiritimati Islands, but I met with some people in Fiji instead, and I'm in a Pacific regional gathering. The people from Tahiti have taken to stage. Their story is similar yet different. A French colony, they stand up and share a recent local protest demanding compensation for nuclear testing over their islands. It was a powerful moment. It showed that somehow something that feels like it should be in the history books is still a matter of live concern. In an era where Black Lives Matter and systemic racism is of increasing concern, it's important that as part of the wider conversations, we challenge us all to look at our own military history and the decisions that those running the military made about who to send where and why. But let's think a bit more recently now. How did you start this year? Were you on Zoom? Probably. I joined a Zoom meeting with people of peace around the globe marking the introduction of the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This piece of legislation was another step in the global rules-based order that aimed to keep a peace. The UN ambassador to the Kiritimati Islands was the second person to speak. He explained he'd witnessed the testing of nuclear weapons. He was out swimming 2,000 miles from the island, and he saw the ball of flames in the sky. But why is his telling important? Because the treaty doesn't just ban the future development of nuclear weapons, it challenges nuclear states to recognize the real impact of their nuclear past. This is covered in two separate sections. The first is early on, page 1, paragraph 6. It references the unacceptable suffering of the victims of the use of nuclear weapons, such as those in Japan, and those affected by weapons testing. All it really says is nations who sign up should be mindful of this. It sounds small, but let's be honest. Until Call the Midwife a few weeks ago, how many people in sort of comfy middle England had ever really heard of the nuclear testing? Probably not many. So simply to be mindful in among our own nation's history is quite significant. The second more substantial area is Article 6 and asks for social, economic, medical and mental health support for those affected by nuclear weapons testing. I don't know what the Shadow Minister for Peace shared with you last month, but I hope he may have referenced that important article. I don't think it's an area that we can ignore, and it's probably a blockage to us signing up to be part of the agreement. Our shared commitment to Black Lives Matter and climate change needs to drive our engagement and lobbying on this bill. It's not a way to go and win the government round, but if we ignore it, we ignore some of the wider ideology and decisions that have forwarded and encouraged the development of these hideous weapons. I started tonight by highlighting that history makes memories go a bit hazy and key details be lost. The nuclear testing story is part of our nation's history. Britain may now be using systems from elsewhere for its nuclear capability, but it had set out and tested on parts of the world as a way of deciding if it wanted to develop it itself. As the ambassador to the UN said, I saw an enormous flash of light. I thought it could have been an act of God, but that was far from true. Nuclear-armed states conducted hundreds of nuclear-armed tests throughout the Pacific Islands, experimenting on bodies, irradiating our lands and seas, and disrupting our cultures. As I heard that, I was reminded once again of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights leader, FOR USA member, who delivered probably a pretty punishing sermon. He declared he didn't want to live in a peace that was built upon the economic or social suffering of others. And it could be said that in reality, the so-called nuclear peace that many people lived under for decades, that many of us campaigned against, was built upon the suffering and exploitation of others in parts of the world that we probably don't know about, that many of us have never been to. But that's not the full picture. We're joined tonight by Brian, and it's really interesting to look in more detail at the British Nuclear Veterans Association and their work. I was quite struck that their work, unlike many rights and advocacy organisations, links the British story with the story of the people who lived on the islands when they were tested. You look at plaques such as those in Scotland and elsewhere, you'll see that often it's not just British military victims, but also the people who lived on the islands that are named. It's a recognition that that whole era was a scandal, and it was the political leaders who made the decisions, and it was everyone else who suffered. So while I haven't possibly brought the most uplifting and exciting presentation to you tonight, I think it's important that if we're to build a peaceful future, we face and name our past. We recognise a world tackling climate change needs to change its approach to the climate. And for as long as our history includes stories such as these, we can see that tackling the military machine and challenging how weapons are created and developed is as much a part as turning off the light bulbs and switching to an electric car. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, John. I would disagree with you on that last point. I think you've really uplifted us, actually. Say that. Let's go say,
It's a challenge of Zoom. You don't get a sense of the room.
Yeah, you didn't dazzle us with spreadsheets and charts and things, but no, that was a very powerful message, I think, and I'm sure everybody else did as well. I'd like to open the floor to anybody else who wants to ask you questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Brian, I think we'd all love to hear from you. Brian, for those of you who went in at the beginning of this session, Brian joined us and told us that he was actually in Tuvalu, I think you said you were in, at the time of the tests. So, yeah, we'd love to hear any comments you've got.
I think I'm here under a false pretenses, really. My experience is very limited. I happened to be working in Tuvalu at the time of one of the tests. And, it must have been evening, I think.
Closer than anybody else here, I think it's fair to say.
Sorry?
It's closer than anybody else here was to the tests at the time.
I expect so, yes. All I remember was that there was just, they were counting down with a watch to see when it would be. And at the moment, the sky turned completely sort of creamy white, as I remember, but it was, so the whole of the eastern sky was in a flash sort of suddenly turned white. And the comment of the cowboy, the sort of magistrate of the island. Funafuti was an atoll with about 600 people at that time. It's very different today. But his word was just whakamataku, which is frightening. It sounds a bit sort of weak, really, for the experience, but it was really impressive to people who were there and sort of made them think a lot.
Thanks very much, Brian. Anybody else got any either questions to put to John or any other observations on what he's told us? Just put your hand up, or which is probably easier if you've got any comments. Sherwood, over to you.
Yeah. John, you made reference to, I think it was the third test, being the largest fission device that the British government had been able to build, and that only came to light after the Cold War. You intrigued us with that, in the sense that you suggested that there was a little bit of kind of pretending / skullduggery going on here. Just tell us a little bit more as to why you actually used that phrase.
So I partly use the phrase because that's how the official history is written up. My overall reading of the history was Britain was testing its nuclear capability, realized it couldn't quite afford or manage to develop a fully independent nuclear deterrent, and so did enough that it could do the big flashbang that got it its seat at the UN and other places, and then behind the scenes, as particularly Labour Party historians will know, was rapidly rebuilding agreements with the US that it had let slide when it began to redevelop its nuclear capabilities. So that's sort of what was going on. I think Britain was trying to decide, can we do this? Can we get away with this? Can't quite manage it. But in the process, they delivered a huge bomb.
Because there is also a continuation story, and I think this is when the testing had moved to mid Australia or whatever, when they then had to keep up with the nuclear superpowers. The other superpowers had achieved fusion, but the UK basically just did not have the technology know-how to be able to come even close. And therefore they fudged it, and they actually produced something that the measurements showed that it possibly could have been fusion. But again, interestingly, that also only came to light 30 years later or so, when it was all released, and no one really minded anymore. And actually, those people who did then look at what had come to light thought it was quite funny that, you know, they'd managed to pull the wool over the eyes of the other superpowers, and that they had pretended that they had created fusion. Does that part of the story ring any bells with you, or is it something that you've also looked into?
I haven't looked in detail, but I think the overall frenetic pace that all of the testing was happening under just before the sort of global ban on atmospheric testing came in meant that what you've described wouldn't surprise me.
John.
I was wondering what the state of the actual islands is now. I'm so ignorant about these things.
So the island is an independent nation. So that and various other nations gained their independence from the UK in the 1970s. And so it's just one of the many small Pacific islands that's it's sort of fully functioning independent state. But as indicated, because of sea rising due to climate change, there's significant risk. And the main problem is it's really remote from anywhere. So I could have gone there for no less than a week, one plane in, one plane out. And when there, you're reliant on whatever's been brought over. And as the sea levels rise, then salted water begins to flood a lot of the natural water systems. So there's that sort of oncoming threat, which was why earlier I was referencing the sort of problems of, you know, small amounts of nuclear problems with sea fish and other things. So that's the new threat and the new challenge. It's, you know, I can't remember, I'll look it up in a moment. It's quite a lot, you know, reasonably sized population. It's not tiny.
And it's still inhabited sort of quite strongly.
Yes. And I certainly discovered in Fiji, there's quite a vibrant, wide Pacific region culture of all of the islands getting together. So I sat down with, I think, one of the lead ministers from a church there, and had quite a long conversation about Britain's nuclear history and where it's alive and where its challenges are. So I'm just looking up its current population. 7,380 people in 2020.
Thank you.
Karen put her hand up.
Sorry, Karen, were you going to ask something?
Yes. You mentioned about Tahiti and France, and you know, again, reluctance for compensation and things. What about the US? Presumably, they haven't been forthcoming with any compensations.
I can't remember off the top of my head. I know overall Britain is most backward.
Right.
So Fiji has already compensated Fijians who Britain took to the region, to the Kiribati Island under testing. I think France has done some. I don't know about the United States. And at one point, all I could find from Britain was the DFID-funded nuclear cleanup that I referred to earlier when looking at things like the giant train of paperwork. It gets a bit murky. The debate in Parliament suggests an offer had been made at least to British service people, but no mention of people who lived on the island. And I think it's quite important when I say to see them as equals. People were there for very different reasons, but in terms of natural justice. But I know there's quite vibrant sort of rights campaigns in each region among sort of, you know, people in France, Britain, in the UK, people in America calling for that.
Thank you.
Jenny, I think you wanted to say. Can you unmute, Jenny? Can you unmute, Jenny, please? Jenny, we can't hear you. You need to unmute.
To speak.
Well, because she put her hand up, she's really.
Yes. Sorry,
There
can
we
you
go.
hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, right. I didn't realise you'd muted everybody. Very sensible. I can't help thinking that going back to about 15 months, we had a peace group meeting about the Chagos Islanders and Diego Garcia, where the British went in and decided that there weren't many people living there and they could take over the islands and
Americans
with the Americans and build a great, well, the largest airbase in the world. And similarly, there are groups of Chagos Islanders, I think, living over here,
Crawley.
but in Crawley, yes, thanks, Phil, and who are trying very hard to get to be allowed back onto their own islands. So it's a similar sort of, I can't believe,
stealing.
Yes, we've stolen their land from them. And we've just gone about the world almost deciding that what we do is so much more important than the people who are living in these areas. It's most shameful.
I think it's important we make those links and we include them as part of our general campaigns and advocacy work. there's huge networks of people from all around the world who live in the UK, let alone elsewhere. And I think the more rounded we make our campaigning, the better. And that's why I was quite struck by a lot. That was where the shape for my overall talk came from, which was why I was about the wider decisions behind let's go and test our weapons in this area or exploit this, because it relies on exploiting so many people in so many ways, usually from decisions made by a very small number of people.
John, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, I mean, this sounds as if it was a little bit of a departure from your normal day-to-day job, but obviously you kind of thought, gosh, what a great opportunity to learn something that I didn't know before. What are you going to be able to do with this now, moving forward?
That's a very good question. I think include it in our campaign work around Britain signing up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Oh, I've got the treaty wrong. The treaty that bans nuclear weapons around the world, and recognise within that it is the Pacific Island states and others that took the global lead in bringing that about. And separate and linked to that, we will be working with other FOR branches from around the world to talk about the military and climate change, because I think the same abuse of resources is clear in the way that we have destroyed the environment, as the way that in the 50s the military establishment could have been said to allow the sort of destruction of people by exposing them to military testing when they may not have known the full impact of it. So overall, the FOR's work at the moment splits into 3 broad areas. We promote peace through Peace Sunday. So those of you who are in religious groups, this year it will be on the 19th of September, which is the Sunday closest to the UN International Day of Peace. I'm available to give sermons, and so are other people as well. So do consider inviting us. We carry out educational conferences, which usually happen in the spring each year. And then alongside the education work, we do campaigns work. So it's going to be peace and climate change from this summer onwards. And then we do international engagement. So the international FOR, which links up branches around the world, has representation at the United Nations. And also we link up with local branches to support their grassroots peacemaking through our International Peacemakers Fund, which gives small grants of £3,000 to £4,000 to support non-violent work, which often sort of goes on under the radar. So that's our broad areas of work. So you can hear it sort of filter across that, and it featured a lot in our online talks and conversations last year. So our annual council, our AGM, we invited Reverend James Bhagwan, who is the Pacific Conference of Churches, the ecumenical, so all churches organization for the region, gave us his overview of the legacy today of nuclear weapons in the region and why it is still a live topic. So I'll share that link with you. And we also had Dr. Becky Alexis Martin, who I referenced, who gave a contribution as well. She's the academic from the UK who spent most time and made it to the Kiritimati Islands to meet with survivors and had lined us up to meet with some people.
And where does your funding come from, John?
Well, it comes from individuals, members of FOR, and anyone who hears about us, who wants to send us a one-off or a regular donation. Organizations, so, I think picked up sort of Quaker groups, churches, all sorts, in your mission funds or whatever language you have, we're very, very welcome of any check that you happen to send to our Peace House, 19 Paradise Street, Oxford. Can't remember the postcode. I can send you that. OX1 1LD. That's it. We do get some grants, but haven't for a while. I've only been director for about 2 years, so I'm just trying to rebuild relationships with grant givers as we begin to increase our digital campaigning and also our sort of grassroots reconciliation work. And then we get legacies as well, because we were founded in 1914. We've supported people through many generations. That includes conscientious objectors, whether they were absolutists or, for example, I think we heard mention of forestry work earlier. And you might be interested to know that Henry Carter, who founded the Methodist Peace Fellowship, which is a network within FOR, was actually the man who came up with the forestry scheme when they were beginning to think, well, what can we offer for people who are not what's called absolutists, but will do some form of work that doesn't directly contribute. So we've got, we've shaped and helped people find their voice for peace for over 100 years. And so we receive some generous legacies ever so often.
This is the stage at the meeting in which we'd normally ask how many people want coffee and how many people want tea. Thanks, Phil. And we would normally, while the coffee and tea is being brewed, we'd sort of just continue with informal chat. If people would like to do that, you're free to either leave or chat or do whatever you like. John, thank you very much for a very interesting evening. It's been lovely to meet you again, and do give our regards, certainly from Jill and I, to the rest of your family, who I'm sure you're in contact with. We'd love to see you in Faringdon sometime, and you gave us a date just then.
Yes, I've written it down.
The 19th of September.
Yep.
We're going to see what we can do about that and getting you back to Faringdon.
That would be great. It'd be a pleasure to attend.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks everybody.
John, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all. And as I said, I think, I can't remember whose email address I've got. I'll send, so we are part of a wider group called Faiths for the Climate, and we're putting together a briefing to do with some broad asks in time for the COP, which we sort of all agree on climate change. So I think the two broad ones are, one is on loss and damage. So I spoke earlier about the sort of climate impact of nuclear testing. And so this is actually looking at, how are we supporting as rich nations which are suffering because of climate change. And the other is about continuing the UK's announced but not implemented ban on future funding of fossil fuel extraction. So that's got the Quakers, Methodists, various other, both religious and secular groups. So I'll forward that as well to help your conversations. Okay, everyone. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Round of applause again, I think, definitely.